And welcome back, everyone, to our special report, Internet Escorts, a return to Gilgo Beach. Now, early in the program, you met author Bob Kolker. His new book on the Gilgo Beach case, Lost Girls, an American Murder Mystery, it hit the New York Times bestseller list. And he's kind enough to join us now. And it's both a murder mystery, but to me, and while that's compelling, it also, I think, turns back, I think, a lot of the misconceptions and also some of the hard truths about this case. If you could find commonality of the five women you really focus on this, it's not that they maybe came from the traditional backgrounds a lot of people think of when they think of a prostitute on the corner. They all came into this because they were looking to find money in a marketplace where they could kind of dictate the terms here. But again, unfortunately, as we learned, with none of the protections, and really obviously an unregulated market.
Exactly, Rich. I'm a reporter for New York Magazine, and I cover lots of newsworthy events in the New York area. And when the first four bodies appeared on Gilgo Beach in December of 2010, that was an obvious story to cover. But then what happened after that was anything but obvious. It was a very peculiar case in lots of ways, but what was most surprising to me was just how these women, plus the fifth one, Shannon Gilbert, defied expectations. Everyone assumed they had no life, that they were outcasts, that they were drifters, that they were lost souls even before they disappeared. And the police certainly felt that way about them. But what I learned is they had families, they had lives, and they were taking part in this new type of prostitution where the barrier to entry is low, where it's seemingly safer, and where you can maintain a traditional life in a way that perhaps women hadn't been able to in the past.
Let's try and, if we could, put some kind of metrics to this. I know there's no scientific study that shows how big this is, but I know there was a study where they looked over 1 month, and on a daily average, there was, what, 1,700 postings, whether it be on Craigslist or Backpage here, of sex internet workers. It's a huge marketplace.
Exactly. I mean, it's like any number of industries. The growth is on the internet. If you're right, there aren't ways to quantify it quite yet, but those who are studying this understand that almost everyone who is getting into prostitution now is using the internet. There are no, or practically no, new people who are walking down the street. And so this is the way that this trend is changing, and that's the biggest change in prostitution, perhaps in decades or even more than a century.
Clearly, nobody goes into this for a life's vocation, but as clearly in your book, they're in this for the money, and the appeal of the internet is there's no middleman here. They're not giving 3/4 of their paycheck either to a service to coordinate it or certainly to the pimp. They're picking their own clients, if you will, and their own places. It's transactional. But as we've also seen, where they made an allure for a fast buck, there is nobody, not even a pimp, as destructive as that relationship is, who is performing any form of even basic security. They're on their own.
Exactly, and they feel secure because they're not in a bad neighborhood. They're working on the internet, and for the most part, perhaps they're doing in-calls, meaning people come to them, and that makes them feel even more like they're their own boss. They set their own hours, they're in charge, and there was even some scholarship on this in the past 4 or 5 years. People saying that the internet was going to professionalize prostitution, was going to bring it out of the shadows, was going to help remove the stigma and help give people greater independence. But while that might be true for a small subset of the people doing it, the fact of the matter is these people are still very vulnerable, and perhaps deceptively so. They may have a false sense of security, and certainly that was the case with the women I wrote about.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I thought in reading this book, and I remember when the story first broke, how the PD at the time, in fact, said, say that again to me over the phone, where, how many, where, and then the bodies kept turning up and up and up. But as soon as the reporting came out and said, oh, they're prostitutes, there seemed to be an okay but. In terms of how not only it was covered, how it was received. I mean, you went to the areas, you not only spoke to the families, but you went to the communities. If it was, 9 secretaries that didn't come home from work that day, or kids that went to school and didn't come back, the reaction and the outrage would have been completely different than these young women, just because they were prostitutes. And while people don't admit it, that's the dirty truth that no one can really debate, is it?
Exactly. No one can debate that. In Lost Girls, you see time and again the families and the loved ones of these, these victims are running into that barrier. Every time they try to get through, people don't pay attention because they say, oh, somehow they had it coming or they took the risks. I mean, in our society, there are a lot of high-risk professions out there where we don't blame the victim if something bad happens to them, but we're more than willing to do that with prostitution. We're also very willing, even though the demand for sex never goes away, the demand for commercial sex never goes away, we're more than willing to pretend it doesn't exist at all. And so that shrug happens. And I'll admit it, I shrugged too in the very beginning. I thought, well, I can't report on this because I won't be able to learn anything about these victims. But I think that Lost Girls, hopefully anyway, is a corrective for that. It's a chance to help people look at this in a different way and to not just look at the mystery of who killed these women, and I certainly hope there's an arrest in this case as soon as possible, but also the broader mystery of what made them so vulnerable to begin with. Maybe partly it was their decision to take a risk, but maybe it also was partly the police's decision not to take their problems seriously.
Did you find that the fighting between the DA's office and the police was as pronounced as a lot of people claim it was?
I do believe that. I think that the different factions in Suffolk County were already built into this situation long before those bodies were discovered. So there's Thomas Spoda, the district attorney, and then the commissioner at the time, Richard Dorma, coming from two different political worlds. Spoda not liking what Dormer's doing with the police department to begin with, and then Dormer steps up and starts to explain his theory of the case, which is that these 4 bodies plus the 5 more sets of remains that have been found along Ocean Parkway are all the work of one killer, and that Shannon is separate. Spoda steps up and says, it could be more than one. We don't know this. No one else. He goes even further. He says, no police officer I've talked to believes what the commissioner's saying. It's open war in the pages of the newspaper, and it's unseemly. It's bad for the investigation, and it's bad for future prosecution of, God willing, if there's an arrest and a trial.
Do you think, bringing it full circle, Bob, that there is at least an awareness at the state level, at other agency levels, that this is a Wild West right now? This is real. Everybody turns a blind eye for what's going on the Craigslist or the back pages right now, but this isn't just, this is a better way of doing modern prostitution, some victimless crime. Somebody's got to put some oversight into this thing. You can't just pretend this thing away. Right now, forget about not being ungoverned. We have evidence that this leads to tragedy, but yet nobody really seems incentivized to really do anything about it. Again, maybe because we're talking about prostitutes. But nonetheless, it seems that this thing could happen again and again, and maybe is, and we just don't know.
I think it's happening all over the country. There's a Detroit case with Escorts. There's a Canada case that's unbelievable, something like more than 50 victims. It's not really a New York thing. It's happening everywhere. And of course, going back to Jack the Ripper and to Joel Rifkin, it's prostitutes who end up being targeted because they live in the shadows, and they live in the shadows because we stigmatize prostitutes. Imagine a world where a prostitute actually feels safe coming to the police if they feel they're in danger. Because even though they are breaking the law, they understand that the police are there to protect public safety. Certainly if you're a low-level pot dealer and you're having some sort of trouble, you feel like, some of them at least, feel like they can come to the police. We need to work on this stigma, and it starts with what you said, Rich. It starts with let's stop pretending that prostitution just doesn't happen. I stay off of the debate about legalization, and I do that deliberately in the book because I think that, we are capable of compassion and outreach and protection of people regardless of what they do for a living.
Again, it's a fascinating book, Lost Girls here, and it's a lot more than just the story here of a serial killer. It's also a lot more, and I think the part I like most is the backstory of these girls and how we've gotten to where we are right now. Bob, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Rich.
Great job. Thank you very much. RFL will be right back after this break with more. Please stay with us.